The moment I saw Lucas across the crowded restaurant, 20 years melted away like snow in spring. My heart raced, palms sweaty as I gripped my wine glass. I shouldn't have come. Amelia? His voice, deeper now, but still unmistakable, sent a shiver down my spine. I turned, forcing a smile. Lucas, it's been a long time. He stood there, salt and pepper hair framing those same intense blue eyes I'd fallen for in high school. The years had been kind to him, adding distinguished lines around his eyes and mouth. "You look amazing," he said, pulling out the chair across from me. "I wasn't sure you'd show up." I laughed nervously. Honestly, I wasn't sure either, but here I am. The waiter appeared, breaking the tension. We ordered drinks, our eyes never leaving each other. "So," Lucas began, leaning forward. "How've you been? Last I heard, you were climbing the corporate ladder in Chicago." I nodded, grateful for the easy topic. "Executive VP now. It's been a wild ride, but I love it. What about you? Still in construction?" "Yep. Started my own company about 10 years ago. It's doing well." He paused, his expression softening. "But let's not dance around it, Amelia. Why did you agree to meet after all this time?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I thought it was time. Emily's almost 18 now, and Lucas's face paled. "Emily, you mean?" "Yes," I said quietly. "Our daughter." The shock on his face was quickly replaced by anger. "Our daughter? Amelia, what the hell? You told me you didn't want anything to do with me or the baby." I recoiled, confusion etched across my face. "What? No, that's not what happened at all. Your mother said you wanted nothing to do with us." Lucas slammed his fist on the table, causing nearby diners to stare. "My mother? What does she have to do with this?" "Everything," I hissed, leaning closer. "She told me you'd left town, that you wanted a clean break. I was young and scared, Lucas. I believed her." He ran a hand through his hair, visibly shaken. "This can't be happening, all these years." "I'm sorry," I whispered, reaching for his hand. He didn't pull away. "I should have tried harder to find you, to get the truth. But I was just a kid, and your mother was persuasive." Lucas's eyes met mine, a storm of emotions swirling in their depths. "Tell me about her. Emily, what's she like?" I smiled despite the tension. "She's amazing, smart, stubborn, creative. She has your eyes, you know." He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Does she know about me?" "She knows you exist, but not much else." I wasn't sure how to explain it all. Lucas leaned back, processing. "So what now? Why tell me all this after so long?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what came next. "Because Emily deserves to know her father, and because I never stopped loving you, Lucas. I know it's crazy, but—" His phone buzzed loudly, interrupting. Lucas glanced at it, his face darkening. "It's my mother. I should take this." As he stepped away to answer, I sat there, heart pounding. What had I done? 20 years of secrets and lies, all unraveling in a single evening, and the biggest bombshell was yet to come. How would Emily react to all this? Lucas returned, his expression grim. "That was my mother. She knows we're meeting. Amelia, I think we've both been played for fools all these years." I nodded, a mix of anger and determination rising within me. "Then it's time we set things right, don't you think?" He reached across the table, taking my hand. "Together?" "Together," I agreed, squeezing his hand. As we left the restaurant, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The past was about to collide with the present, and I had no idea if my carefully constructed life would survive the impact. I paced the living room, rehearsing the words I'd say to Emily. How do you tell your 17-year-old daughter that her long-lost father is suddenly back in the picture? The doorbell rang, startling me out of my thoughts. "I'll get it," Emily called from upstairs. "No, honey, I've got it," I replied, my heart racing. It was Lucas, right on time. I opened the door, and there he stood, looking as nervous as I felt. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey yourself," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Emily's upstairs. I haven't told her you're coming." Lucas nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea, Amelia. What if she hates me?" I squeezed his arm. "She won't hate you. She might be confused, maybe even angry, but she won't hate you." "Mom?" Emily's voice drifted down the stairs. "Who's here?" I took a deep breath. "Emily, can you come down? There's someone I'd like you to meet." Emily appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes widening as she saw Lucas. She looked from him to me, confusion etched on her face. "What's going on?" "Sweetheart," I began, my voice shaking slightly. This is Lucas. He's your father." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily stood frozen, her knuckles white as she gripped the banister. "Hi, Emily," Lucas said softly. "I know this is a shock, and I'm so sorry for not being in your life until now." Emily's eyes flashed with anger. "Sorry? You're sorry?" She turned to me. "Mom, what the hell is this?" "Language, Emily," I admonished reflexively, then immediately regretted it. "I know this is a lot to take in. Why don't we all sit down and talk about it?" "Talk about what?" Emily spat. "How you've lied to me my entire life. How she jabbed a finger at Lucas, suddenly decides to show up after 17 years. "It's not like that," Lucas started, but Emily cut him off. "I don't want to hear it," she said, turning on her heel and storming back upstairs. Her bedroom door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house. I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. "That went well," I muttered. Lucas sat beside me, his arm hesitantly wrapping around my shoulders. "Give her time, Amelia. It's a lot to process." Just then, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it and groaned. "It's your mother." Lucas stiffened. "What does she want?" I showed him the text. "Heard you're playing Happy Families. Don't forget who really raised that girl. Dinner tomorrow. No excuses." "She has some nerve," Lucas growled. "What do we do?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed. Before Lucas could answer, the doorbell rang again. I opened it to find Mrs. Collins standing there, her face a mask of false concern. "Amelia, dear," she said, pushing past me into the house. "I thought I'd drop by to see how my granddaughter is handling the news." Her eyes landed on Lucas. "Oh, you're here too. How convenient." "Mother," Lucas said, his voice tight, "this isn't a good time." Mrs. Collins waved her hand dismissively. "Nonsense, there's never a bad time for family." She raised her voice. "Emily, darling, Grandma's here." I heard Emily's door open, and she appeared at the top of the stairs again, her eyes red-rimmed. "Grandma?" Mrs. Collins opened her arms. "Come here, sweetheart. I'm sure you need a shoulder to cry on after all this unpleasantness." Emily hesitated, then slowly came down the stairs. As she reached the bottom, Mrs. Collins enveloped her in a hug, shooting a triumphant look at Lucas and me over Emily's shoulder. There, she cooed. "Grandma's got you. I know it must be awful to have your whole world turned upside down like this." I felt my anger rising. "Mrs. Collins, I think you should leave. This is a family matter." She raised an eyebrow. "I am family, dear. The only stable family Emily's had, it seems." Lucas stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "That's enough, Mother. You need to go. Now." Mrs. Collins released Emily, who looked bewildered by the tension in the room. "Very well," she said coolly, "but this isn't over. Emily deserves to know the truth about everything." With that, she swept out of the house. As the door closed behind her, I turned to see Emily staring at us, her eyes filled with confusion and hurt. "What did she mean, the truth about everything?" she asked quietly. I exchanged a glance with Lucas, knowing that the real storm was just beginning. I stood at the altar, my heart racing as I watched Lucas walk towards me. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, arguments, and reconciliations. Yet here we were, ready to start our life together. Officially this time. "You look beautiful," Lucas whispered as he took my hand. I smiled, fighting back tears. "You don't look so bad yourself." As the minister began the ceremony, I caught sight of Emily in the front row. Her face was a mask of indifference, but I could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. She'd barely spoken to either of us since Lucas moved in, retreating further into herself with each passing day. "I do," Lucas said, his voice strong and sure. "I do," I echoed, squeezing his hand. As we turned to face our guests, a commotion erupted at the back of the church. My blood ran cold as I saw Mrs. Collins striding down the aisle, her face twisted with anger. "I object to this farce of a marriage," she shouted, causing gasps to ripple through the congregation. Lucas stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "Mother, you weren't invited. Please leave." Mrs. Collins laughed bitterly. "Of course I wasn't invited. You wouldn't want the truth to come out, would you?" I felt panic rising in my chest. "Mrs. Collins, this isn't the time or place." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time," she interrupted, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Before you make the biggest mistake of your life, Lucas, there's something you should know." Emily stood up, her face pale. "Grandma, please don't do this." Mrs. Collins ignored her, focusing on Lucas. "Your precious Amelia isn't as innocent as she pretends to be. Did she tell you about the other men she was seeing when you got her pregnant? How she wasn't even sure you were the father? The church fell silent, all eyes on me. I felt the blood drain from my face. That's not true, I whispered. Lucas turned to me. Confusion and hurt etched across his features. Amelia? I shook my head frantically. Lucas, I swear she's lying. There was never anyone else. Mrs. Collins smirked. Oh, really? Then perhaps you'd like to explain these? She pulled out a stack of old letters from her purse. I found these in Lucas's old room. Love letters from other men, dated right around the time Emily was conceived. Lucas snatched the letters, his hands shaking as he read them. I felt my world crumbling around me. Lucas, please, I begged. I don't know where those came from, but they're not mine. You have to believe me. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with pain and betrayal. I don't know what to believe anymore. Emily suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling. Those aren't Mom's letters. We all turned to look at her. She was standing now, fists clenched at her sides. What do you mean, sweetheart? Mrs. Collins asked, her voice sickly sweet. Emily took a deep breath. I found those letters in your study last week, Grandma. They're forgeries. I saw the receipts from the vintage paper store and the handwriting expert you hired. A collective gasp went through the church. Mrs. Collins' face drained of color. Emily, you don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Emily interrupted, her voice growing stronger. You've been trying to keep them apart for years. You lied to both of them back then, and you're lying now. Lucas turned to his mother, his expression hardening. Is this true? Mrs. Collins sputtered, looking around wildly. I was only trying to protect you, Lucas. She wasn't good enough for you then, and she isn't now. Get out, Lucas said, his voice low and dangerous. Get out of this church, and get out of our lives, for good this time. As the ushers escorted a protesting Mrs. Collins out, I turned to Emily, tears in my eyes. Thank you, I whispered. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. I may not be happy about all this, but you're still my mom, and he's my dad. We should at least try to be a family. Lucas wrapped an arm around each of us, pulling us close. I couldn't agree more, he said softly. As we stood there, the three of us together for the first time, I realized that this was just the beginning of our journey. We had a lot of healing to do, a lot of trust to rebuild, but for the first time in years, I felt hope blossoming in my chest. We were a family, flaws and all, and we'd face whatever came next together. The shrill ring of my phone jolted me awake. I fumbled for it in the dark, my heart racing as I saw Janet's name on the screen. Janet? What's wrong? I asked, my voice thick with sleep. Amelia, it's Tom, Janet's husband's voice came through, choked with emotion. Janet, she's gone. Heart attack. I didn't know who else to call. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Janet, my best friend since college, my rock through every crisis, gone? It couldn't be true. I'll be right there, I managed to say before hanging up. Lucas stirred beside me. Amelia? What's happening? I turned to him, tears already streaming down my face. Janet's dead. Heart attack. I have to go. He sat up, pulling me into his arms. I'll come with you. The drive to Janet's house was a blur. When we arrived, the sight of the ambulance in the driveway made it all too real. Tom met us at the door, his face ashen. She's gone, he whispered, collapsing into my arms. The next few hours passed in a haze of grief and disbelief. As dawn broke, I found myself sitting on Janet's back porch, as clutching a mug of cold coffee. Mom? Emily's voice startled me. I hadn't even realized Lucas had gone to pick her up. Oh, sweetie, I said, opening my arms. She hesitated for a moment before stepping into my embrace. I'm so sorry about Aunt Janet, she murmured. I held her tightly, grateful for this moment of connection amidst the chaos. Thank you, honey. I know you loved her too. As Emily pulled away, I saw Lucas watching us from the doorway, his face etched with concern. I knew he felt helpless, unsure how to comfort us in our grief. The days that followed were a whirlwind of funeral arrangements and condolence calls. I threw myself into helping Tom, grateful for the distraction from my own pain. But as the day of the funeral dawned, the reality of Janet's absence hit me anew. Standing at the podium to deliver the eulogy, I looked out at the sea of faces. Tom, broken and lost. Emily, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. Lucas, his gaze steady and supportive. And there, in the back row, Mrs. Collins, her expression unreadable. I took a deep breath and began. Janet was more than my best friend. She was my sister in every way that mattered. As I spoke about Janet's life, her kindness, her infectious laugh, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was my last gift to her, to ensure that everyone knew how extraordinary she was. After the service, as people milled about offering condolences, Mrs. Fresca Collins approached me. "Amelia, dear," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. Such a lovely eulogy. Janet would have been touched. I stiffened, wary of her sudden kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "You know, Janet confided in me before she passed. She was quite concerned about you and Lucas rushing into things. She thought Emily might be better off with me for a while, given all the upheaval." I felt as if I'd been slapped. "What are you talking about?" Mrs. Collins smiled sadly. "Oh, I hate to bring this up now, but Janet was worried about Emily's college fund. She mentioned you might have borrowed from it for your wedding. She just wanted to make sure Emily's future was secure." My mind reeled. Janet would never have said such things, would she? And how dare Mrs. Collins bring this up now, of all times? Before I could respond, Lucas appeared at my side. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice tight. Mrs. Collins patted my arm, "Just offering my condolences. We'll talk more later, dear." As she walked away, I turned to Lucas, my emotions a tangled mess of grief, anger, and confusion. "What did she want?" he asked. I shook my head, unable to form words. How could I tell him that our happiness might be tearing our family apart? That even Janet, my dearest friend, might have doubted us? As I looked across the room at Emily, standing alone and looking lost, I realized I had a decision to make. One that could change everything. The somber atmosphere of Janet's funeral weighed heavily on me as I stood near her casket, accepting condolences from a seemingly endless line of mourners. Lucas hovered nearby, his presence both comforting and somehow distant. Emily had retreated to a corner, her face a mask of quiet grief. As the last of the guests offered their sympathies, I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. Mrs. Collins approached, her face a picture of false concern. "Amelia, dear," she cooed, "such a tragedy. Janet was such a pillar of the community." I nodded stiffly, bracing myself for whatever Barb was coming next. "You know," Mrs. Collins continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "Janet and I had quite a long chat just last week. She was so concerned about Emily's future." My guard instantly went up. "What are you talking about?" Mrs. Collins' eyes gleamed with malice. "Well, it seems Janet was worried about Emily's inheritance. She mentioned something about you dipping into Emily's college fund for your hasty wedding." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "That's absurd," I hissed. "Janet would never." "Oh, but she did," Mrs. Collins interrupted. "She was quite distressed about it. In fact, she suggested that perhaps Emily would be better off living with me for a while, given all the upheaval in your household." Red-hot anger surged through me. How dare she use Janet's memory to manipulate us? "Mrs. Collins," I said, my voice dangerously low, "I don't know what game you're playing, but this ends now. Janet would never have said those things, and you know it." She feigned innocence. "I'm only relaying what Janet told me, dear. Perhaps we should discuss Emily's living arrangements and her financial future. After all, it's what Janet would have wanted." Something inside me snapped. "Enough!" I shouted, drawing startled looks from the remaining mourners. "How dare you use my best friend's funeral to push your agenda? You've been trying to tear this family apart from the moment Lucas and I reconnected, and I won't stand for it anymore." Mrs. Collins' face hardened. "Now, Amelia, let's not make a scene." "No, let's make a scene," I retorted, my voice rising. "Let's talk about how you lied to Lucas and me 20 years ago, keeping us apart. Let's discuss how you've manipulated Emily, poisoning her against her own father. You're toxic, Mrs. Collins, and I won't let you hurt my family anymore." Lucas appeared at my side, his face a mix of concern and determination. "Mother, I think it's time for you to leave." Mrs. Collins' eyes darted between us, realizing she'd lost this round. "This isn't over," she hissed before turning on her heel and stalking away. As the door slammed behind her, I became acutely aware of the stunned silence in the room. Emily stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. "Mom?" she whispered. What just happened?" I felt the weight of every eye in the room on me. The truth I'd been holding back for so long threatened to spill out. But was this really the time or place? Lucas squeezed my hand. "Amelia," he said softly, "I think it's time we told Emily everything." No more secrets. I looked at my daughter, seeing the hurt and uncertainty in her eyes. Then I glanced at Janet's photo on the casket, her warm smile seeming to encourage me even now. Taking a deep breath, I made my decision. "You're right," I said to Lucas. Then, turning to Emily, I held out my hand. "Sweetheart, there's something we need to tell you. About your grandmother, about your father and me, about everything." Emily hesitated for a moment before taking my hand. As we moved to a quiet corner of the room, I knew that whatever came next would change our family forever. But with Janet's memory to guide me and Lucas by my side, I was finally ready to face the truth, and whatever consequences came with it. The days following Janet's funeral blurred together in a haze of grief and tension. Emily had retreated further into herself after our revelation, barely speaking to Lucas or me. I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own home, the weight of unspoken words crushing us all. It was a crisp Saturday morning when everything came to a head. I was in the kitchen, mindlessly stirring a cup of coffee when Lucas burst through the door, his face ashen. "Amelia, we need to talk. Now." The urgency in his voice sent chills down my spine. "What's wrong?" He thrust a stack of papers onto the counter. "I found these in my mother's study. She's been lying to us for years." My hands shook as I picked up the documents, forged letters, manipulated bank statements, even a fake paternity test, all designed to keep Lucas and me apart, to make him believe I wanted nothing to do with him or our unborn child. "Oh my God," I whispered, feeling sick to my stomach. "Lucas, I had no idea." "I know," he cut me off, his voice tight with anger. "But that's not all. Look at the last page." I flipped to the final document, my eyes widening in horror. It was a petition for guardianship of Emily, filed by Mrs. Collins just days ago. "She's trying to take our daughter," I breathed, panic rising in my chest. Before Lucas could respond, the front door slammed open. Mrs. Collins strode in, flanked by two stern-looking men in suits. "I'm sorry it's come to this," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But it's clear that Emily needs a stable home environment." I stepped forward, fury coursing through my veins. "How dare you? After everything you've done, you think you have any right to our daughter?" Mrs. Collins smiled coldly. "I have every right. I've been more of a parent to her than either of you. And now, with all the upheaval in your lives, it's time for Emily to come live with me permanently." Lucas moved to stand beside me, his jaw clenched. "You're not taking her anywhere, Mother. We know the truth now, all of it." For a moment, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in Mrs. Collins' eyes, but she quickly recovered, her mask of superiority firmly back in place. "Truth? What truth? All I see are two selfish adults who've turned that poor girl's life upside down. Emily needs stability, structure, something you clearly can't provide." As if on cue, Emily appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "What's going on?" Mrs. Collins turned to her, arms outstretched. "Emily, darling, come down. It's time to go home with Grandma." I felt my world tilting on its axis. This couldn't be happening. We couldn't lose Emily. Not now, not after everything we'd been through. "Emily, please," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "Don't listen to her. We love you. We want you here with us." Emily hesitated, her gaze darting between us and her grandmother. The tension in the room was palpable, every second stretching into an eternity. Suddenly, Lucas stepped forward, his voice steady and determined. "Mother, this ends now. You've manipulated and lied to all of us for far too long. I won't let you tear this family apart anymore." Mrs. Collins' face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful boy. After everything I've done for you." "Everything you've done?" I exploded, unable to contain my anger any longer. "You mean like keeping Lucas from his child for 18 years? Poisoning Emily against us? Trying to steal our daughter?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Mrs. Collins. For the first time, I saw a crack in her carefully constructed facade. She looked scared. "I was only trying to protect my family," she stammered. "No," Lucas said firmly. "You were trying to control us, and it stops now." As we stood there, the air thick with tension, I realized we'd reached a turning point. Whatever happened next would define our family forever. I looked at Emily, still frozen on the stairs, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and dawning understanding. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. Taking a deep breath, I stepped towards Mrs. Collins, my voice low and dangerous. "Get out of our house, now, And if you ever try to come between us and our daughter again, I swear I'll—" The silence that followed my outburst was deafening. Mrs. Collins stood frozen, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. Lucas placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, his touch grounding me in the storm of emotions. "Mother," Lucas said, his voice low and controlled, "I think it's time for you to leave." Mrs. Collins' eyes darted between us, desperation creeping into her expression. "Lucas, surely you can't believe these lies. Everything I've done has been for you, for our family." I felt Lucas tense beside me. This was the moment of truth, the crossroads where he'd have to choose between the mother who raised him and the family he'd just found. "No, Mother," he said firmly. "Everything you've done has been for yourself. You've lied, manipulated, and hurt us all. I won't let you do it anymore." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A strangled sob from the stairs reminded us that Emily was still there, witnessing everything. "Emily, sweetheart," I began, taking a step towards her. But before I could reach her, Mrs. Collins made her final, desperate move. She lunged forward, grabbing Emily's arm. "Come with me, darling. I'll protect you from these people who've done nothing but lie to you." Emily's eyes widened in fear, and I saw red. Without thinking, I surged forward, wrenching Mrs. Collins' hand away from my daughter. "Don't you dare touch her!" In the chaos that followed, I barely registered Lucas calling the police or Mrs. Collins's hysterical screaming. All I could focus on was Emily, trembling and pale, caught in the middle of this nightmare. As the police arrived and began questioning everyone, I pulled Emily into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." She clung to me, her body shaking with silent sobs. Over her shoulder, I watched as Lucas gave his statement to the officers, his face a mix of pain and determination. Hours later, after Mrs. Collins had been escorted away and the house had fallen into an uneasy quiet, the three of us sat in the living room, emotionally exhausted. "I heard everything," Emily said suddenly, her voice small. "I was at the top of the stairs. I heard what Grandma did." Lucas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Emily, we never wanted you to find out like this. We were trying to protect you." She looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did you let me believe all those things about you, Dad?" The word Dad hung in the air, fragile and new. Lucas's breath caught, and I saw the emotions play across his face. "I was afraid," he admitted softly. "Afraid you wouldn't want me, afraid I'd mess everything up. I should have been braver for you." I reached out, taking both their hands in mine. We all should have been braver. But Emily, you have to know that everything we've done, every decision we've made, has been out of love for you. Emily nodded slowly, processing. I don't know who to trust anymore. Grandma was always there for me, and now—" "I know, sweetheart," I said, my heart breaking for her. "But we're here now, all of us together. We can figure this out." As we sat there, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us, I realized that this was just the beginning. We had a long road ahead, full of healing and rebuilding trust. Lucas squeezed my hand, his eyes meeting mine over Emily's head. In that moment, I saw all the love, pain, and determination we shared. Whatever came next, we'd face it as a family. But as the night wore on and Emily finally drifted off to sleep between us on the couch, a nagging fear gnawed at the edges of my mind. Mrs. Collins' words echoed in my ears. "This isn't over." I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that she was right. This was far from over, and as I looked at my fragile, newly formed family, I wondered if we were strong enough to withstand whatever storm was coming our way. The weeks following Mrs. Collins' dramatic exit were a minefield of emotions. Emily oscillated between anger and grief, lashing out one moment and withdrawing the next. Lucas struggled with guilt, second-guessing every interaction with his daughter. And I felt like I was barely holding us all together with sheer willpower. It all came to a head on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, mindlessly stirring a pot of soup, when I heard raised voices from the living room. "You can't just waltz in here and expect to be my dad!" Emily shouted. "Where were you for the past 17 years? I rushed in to find Emily and Lucas facing off, both red-faced and teary-eyed. "I'm trying, Emily," Lucas pleaded. "I know I can't make up for lost time, but nothing." Emily cut him off. "You left us. You chose to believe Grandma over Mom. How can I ever trust you?" The pain in Lucas's eyes was unbearable. I stepped forward, ready to intervene, when suddenly Emily turned on me. "And you," she cried. "You lied to me my whole life. You let me believe Dad didn't want us. How could you?" Her words hit me like a physical blow. All the guilt, all the regret I'd been carrying for years came crashing down on me. I sank onto the couch, my legs unable to support me any longer. "You're right," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "We've all made terrible mistakes. We've hurt each other in ways that seem unforgivable." The room fell silent, the weight of our shared pain hanging heavy in the air. "But," I continued, finding strength I didn't know I had, "we're family. And family means we don't give up on each other, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." I looked up at Emily, seeing the conflicted emotions warring in her eyes. "Sweetheart, I know we've let you down, but we love you more than anything in this world. Can you give us a chance to prove it?" Emily's lower lip trembled, and for a moment I saw the little girl she used to be, scared, vulnerable, desperate for love and security. Lucas knelt beside her, his voice soft. "Emily, I know I can never make up for the years I missed, but if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be the father you deserve." The tension in the room was palpable as we waited for Emily's response. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared," she admitted. What if we try and it all falls apart again?" I moved to her other side, forming a protective circle around her. "Then we'll pick up the pieces and try again. That's what families do." Emily looked from me to Lucas and back again. Then slowly she nodded. "Okay," she said. "Okay, let's try." The relief that washed over me was indescribable. We weren't magically healed. There was still so much to work through. But we'd taken the first step. As we sat there holding each other and letting the tears flow freely, I felt something shift inside me. The fear and uncertainty that had been my constant companions for so long began to fade, replaced by a cautious hope. Later that night, as Lucas and I lay in bed, emotionally exhausted but oddly at peace, he turned to me. "Amelia," he said softly, "I know we've been through hell, but I want you to know. I'd do it all again if it meant ending up here, with you and Emily." I felt tears prick my eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy. "I love you," I whispered, kissing him softly. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the long road ahead of us. There would be more challenges, more tears, more moments of doubt, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to face them. We were a family. Imperfect, scarred, but unbreakable. And together we could weather any storm. The next morning, I woke to the sound of laughter drifting up from the kitchen. I found Lucas and Emily attempting to make pancakes, flour dusting their clothes and grins on their faces. As I watched them, my heart swelled with love and gratitude. This was what I'd always dreamed of, a family, whole and healing, facing the future together. "Room for one more?" I asked, stepping into the kitchen. Emily looked up, her smile bright and genuine. "Always, Mom, always." And in that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we'd face them as a family, stronger, wiser, and more loving than ever before.